Now today, Jason's going to share how the tender process works and how you can improve your tender process to win more jobs.
The idea that you've got to be in it to win it doesn't really apply.
So what are some of the common mistakes that guys make when submitting tenders?
They've been reading tenders every day of the week, like they do that for a job.
They smell the bull straight away.
Straight away.
Big question, this is I guess what's on everyone's mind. Is it all about price?
There are so many other factors that can get you kind of disqualified and get your tender thrown in the bin. Yeah.
Just because they're a bigger client doesn't mean they do a better job.
I'd say a lot of our clients, like small to medium, underestimate themselves. They think it's too hard, but they smash it.
What does Mr. Newbie do who wants to get their foot in the door?
To improve your chance of winning, I would say the first is...
Well, today I'm really excited about the podcast. We have a guest on the show, Jason Coony from the Tender team. Now, tenders are an interesting beast. Now, you probably fall into a couple of categories with tenders. Maybe you're doing them and you're crushing it, and great work to you. Or you do them and you get really frustrated with the process and it feels like the client's got all the power and the tender process is just about whoever's got the lowest price and they're going to win. Or you're really kind of scared or anxious about putting a tender together because you're not sure how to do it, how it should look and how the process works. So often you just don't do it. Now today, Jason's going to share how the tender process works and how you can improve your tender process to win more jobs. Really looking forward to this. Welcome, Jason. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, awesome. Great to have you here.
Cheers.
Mate, can you just give us an overview of the work that you do with the tender team?
Sure. Well, 60% of our work is helping tradies or people from the construction industry write tenders. So sometimes we help them find tender opportunities, prepare all the documentation, write the response. We don't really help with the pricing, but we always give a bit of guidance on how to deliver the pricing. And we also put together some of the supporting documentation and submit the tender.
Right, so it's really about how to put the tender together so that it gives the best chance for success.
Exactly right.
Yeah, okay, cool. So, mate, let's jump in. There's plenty of contract opportunities out there that people can bid on. So how would you suggest that that people who are thinking about tenders choose the right contracts to bid for? Because obviously some are going to be good and give you a chance for success and some probably not so much.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, there are a few criteria you can kind of work off, like rules of thumb, to pick the right ones. The first thing to know is that there's a fair bit of work involved in tenders, preparing one. So you can't just go for anything and everything. The idea that you've got to be in it to win it doesn't really apply. So you've got to be selective. Looking for contracts in your local area is really important. And the reason for that is because you've got a bigger chance of winning them when you're local. You've got your local tradies, you hire locals, you know the area, you've got a reputation. So that's really important. So looking at tenders that are local is critical. Another point I'd say is look at tenders that are about the size of the current work that you do. So, if you're a tradie, you've got, say, 5 boys working for you, you're a team of 6, and you might work on a couple of schools and you see a school or a university come up for tender. That's something that you say, okay, it's worth having a shot. You might find the local council is looking for electrical maintenance services, for example, for the council buildings, similar size to the school's contract. Sounds like it's worth giving a shot. But if it's going to be to kind of wire up a stadium or something like that, then you'd say, well, it's not in our kind of size bracket yet, so we've got limited chance of success. There's no point in going for it.
So pretty much you want to bite off something that you're actually able to chew as a business.
Yeah, most definitely. And that you've got the kind of expertise and the experience to write a really good tender to win it.
Okay, cool. So big question. This is, I guess, what's on everyone's mind. Is it all about price? And what are the factors that actually influence your chance of winning the bid or the tender?
It is at least, I'd say, 40% about price. And generally speaking, if it's a government tender, which a lot of them are, they'll issue a rating criteria and they'll tell you, okay, look, 40-50% of the assessment criteria is going to be price. So to some extent, it is about price, but it's not all about price. The remaining, say, 50 or 60 or even 70% is about your experience levels, your existing personnel and your team, making sure you've got the right licenses and accreditations, and also making sure that you're a good kind of like business, so that the downstream economic benefits of the contract, you're going to make sure that they flow through to the community, you're environmentally friendly, health and safety is right, and all the rest of it. So it's about price to some extent, but you don't really price the lowest tender and win it, because there are so many other factors that can get you kind of disqualified and get your tender thrown in the bin, that it's not exclusively about price.
So let's talk about the things that could get you thrown in the bin. What are some typical things that when they go through your tender, they're like, nah,
Yep.
that's just a no go.
You've got making sure you've got the right licenses and accreditations would be the first. And that can be something little. So you might be, a qualified plumber. You think you've got everything right, but you need a special grade of plumbing to do commercial work or gas or something along those lines. So they generally don't negotiate around that. Insurances is another one that they won't negotiate around, and that includes insurances for your personnel. So if you say, I mean, under the Australian system as an example, but in America and New Zealand, if you say you've got a team of say 10, but then your workers' compensation insurance is showing 3 personnel on the insurance certificate, then they can often bin it and say, okay, it's not right. Um, You've got a deal breaker, which wouldn't get it binned, but you pretty much haven't got a chance of winning the tender, is not having experience and referees that can at least score reasonably well. So that means, and as we talked about previously about which tenders to go for and which tenders not to go for, if you're going for, say, a commercial tender and you haven't got any private clients yet outside the tendering process and you put in a couple of residential clients as your experience, you're pretty much not going to have a chance. And the other big one is the health and safety documentation. So they ask for the health and safety documentation. You get that wrong, you're pretty much binned as non-compliant tender response.
That's a really interesting one. So if you've got references, testimonials, and attributes for projects that are similar, obviously that's really helpful.
Yep.
So what does Mr. Newbie do who wants to get their foot in the door and has a good business, good tradespeople, but really hasn't quite made the jump to that particular type of work? What do you suggest they do? How can they bridge that gap? Because that's, a lot of people listening will find themselves in that position.
There are two kind of strategies you can use. The first would be to look for work outside of tenders. Now that means you're not tendering, but you are looking for business, you are looking for commercial work from a business development perspective, contacting strata companies, looking for work for universities, contacting site managers of major buildings and so forth. That way, outside tendering, you're already starting to build up, a decent profile of experience. Another option is to look for subcontractor opportunities. So what happens a lot of the time is you've got your standard electrician, someone goes and wins the tender, they've got the tender, and then they're looking to subcontract work off. So you become a subcontractor, and then when you go tender 3 years later, all like we would recommend our clients say is, we haven't got this experience, but we've been the subcontractor for this person for the last 3 years. We know the job, we know the supervisor, he's our referee, they know us well, and we understand that, the requirements and the protocols. So you guys are basically going to save 20 or 30% by awarding the tender to us. And we've been working on it anyway. So that's your second option, which I think is a good one as well. So you can do both of those at the same time. And the third would be, there are some smaller tenders that are less than $100,000 or something along those lines. It might be public toilets at the local stadium and so forth. Now, particularly when they're local, tradies that are relatively small in size still have a pretty good shot of winning them, irrespective of the experience, because sometimes it costs too much. Larger companies don't want to go for those contracts. Other times you can really have a good cracking shot at the local development component, so the local content rules, and you can get bonus points around that.
So basically, it's about thinking long term. So not getting discouraged
Yep.
if you can't jump into it now. It's like, what's our strategy to get some runs on the board, as it were, some street creds,
Yep.
and that might be outside the tenders. This door knocking, other marketing ways to get in front of people, and just
Yeah.
building up the database of work.
Yeah, build up a database of work, subcontract off to some of the bigger guys, and go for some really small tenders, and then you've put yourself into a pretty good position. And tenders is very long term, like they are long term by their very nature. I mean, you've got 3 year, 5 year contracts. You've got referees and experience. When you're going to tender, you've got some really good experience. You can quote that experience even if it's from 1.5 years ago. There's no real issue there. So thinking long term works, and it's beneficial.
If people are listening and they're thinking about, well, how can I actually put myself in the best position? What can they do to actually improve their chances of winning these tenders that they put together?
Okay, so assuming that they're going for a tender, so how can they improve the tender as
Yep.
such? Or
Or improve their
this,
chance of winning.
yeah, to improve your chance of winning, I would say the first is, prior to the tender being released, start to collect your testimonials and referees, because once the tender's released, you can't call certain people if they're in the same department and so forth. So you'd want to have all those collected. The second would be, and the most critical point, is to tailor the tender and put the work into it to tailor it. Now, what I mean by that is they get a tender response and it says, okay, provide 3 previous examples of maintenance works that you've committed uh, for a large building, for example, if you're an electrician. Okay,
Yep.
they need to go into detail and look at what the tender's asking for. So, okay, we're doing electrical works for a school. Then we need to tailor all our previous experience so it's the same as the challenges that are going to be encountered on this job. So what I mean by that is you might have worked on a previous school and you had to work after hours so it wouldn't impact the students. You had to be careful of access and permits to get access to the site. You had to, I don't know, work over the school holidays and it was the methodology needed to be improved so you could get a whole lot of work done within a short period of time so it wouldn't impact their studies and so forth. When you're doing that, you'd want to look at all that and say, okay, these are all the challenges that we faced. We're going to talk about all these, and then we're going to cross-reference into this opportunity because we know that these are the sort of challenges that are going to be faced in this program, and we can show insight into what's going to go wrong and what challenges need to be overcome. So that's tailoring your proposal as opposed to simply saying we serviced the school and we rewired it and everything went fine and that's it. The second would be your CV. So in most tenders, they'll ask for your personal. They want to know about your team. So what a lot of people do is they'll just cut and paste off their website, their team profiles, and submit it as part of the tender. What you would need to do, if we continue the school example, was to say, okay, Jason's a specialist in understands the needs of cabling and so forth in the school environment, and that's linked to data, whatever it may be. We've got 3 apprentices. All of these guys are experiencing this type of work in refitting and retrofitting. They're not new build specialists, so they know what they're doing. They specialize in the education sector and so forth. So you're tailoring your CVs, you're tailoring your personnel, you're tailoring your experience all to the specific tender, which takes time. That's a key point to scoring much more comprehensively. And the third would be to evidence as much as possible. So that would mean that, because what happens is, you're going to get excited when you're writing your tender and you're going to make a few little embellishments and
Yeah,
whatever.
little exaggerations
Yeah,
of
little
capability.
exaggerations are always handy, and everybody does it. But
Yeah,
the procurement guys, they've been reading tenders every day of the week, like they do that for a job, so they can see straight through it when it comes through.
they smell the
Um,
bullshit straight away.
straight away, they do, they do. And I've chatted to some of them, like just in debriefs and so forth, and they've told us like we knew that was fun, we knew it's fluffy, and they get frustrated reading it. So the more evidence you can put in, the better. And if you're looking at localizing your tender, so say you're going for whatever it is, City of Sydney Council or City of Darwin, whatever it may be, you want to localize your tender response. So you want to talk about, okay, these are the local people we're going to hire. We support the local footy team, and anyone can say anything, but you get a letter from the local footy team or a certificate saying you donated $100 6 months ago, and that's more valuable than somebody saying they're going to donate $10,000 in the future, because it's concrete evidence and it gives your tender and your bid a whole lot of credibility. So I'd say take the time to document everything, and because most tradies tender a fair bit, they might tender, lose one, win one, tender again in 2 months. So just store it all somewhere centrally so it's really easy to attach and you beef up the credibility of your tender.
Something that jumped into my mind is a way to sort of understand this. We've all employed people, and we get CVs from people, and you notice that most of the tradespeople or admin staff or whoever it is, they just send in a bulk standard CV that's the same for everyone, and you know that they've basically just been sending this out to
Yeah.
a bunch of people, and it's not impressive.
No, it's almost insulting. You're like, come
Yeah,
on.
it's like,
Yeah.
bro, like, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
do you think I'm stupid? So
Yeah.
the ones that have obviously taken some time and tailored their CV to suit the job application are the ones you look at.
Yeah.
100%. It's exactly the same process, isn't it?
It's the same. It's identical for tenders.
So what are some of the common mistakes that guys make when submitting tenders?
Non-compliance, so they'll put a whole lot of energy into writing the bid. They'll put all their effort in, but then they'll miss a ticker box. Like for example, the entity structure. If it's a trust, not putting the right ABN number. All of those little things can get you caught out, and it leads to a lot of disappointment. The second mistake I'd say is sometimes there's a bit of bureaucracy involved. Like, for example, with Victoria, there's the Victorian Local Jobs Policy, and that takes 15, 20 days to get a certificate. So when you're working through the tender and it's released, if you don't go through and assess all the little government requirements that you need and start on them early, you can get caught out 5 days later, 5 days before the due date, and leads to a lot of stress and doesn't really help out the tender process. I've seen people not submit in time and so forth. So I'd say that's a mistake. The third would be to underestimate how much work's involved. So if you're going to do a good job of a tender, you've got to hit it early, work really hard early on it, coordinate it, and so forth. And if you're busy on the tools, appoint someone within your office to be responsible for the tender, and to work on your bid. So that's important. That's an error. So project management side of it, they're the three kind of main mistakes. I'd say from a writing perspective, it would be probably trying to write overly professionally. It doesn't really work using fancy words and so forth when you're putting in a tender response. The readers can see through it and get bored of it. So plain, simple English that's legible is perfectly fine. And writing concisely is also important. If you're established in, I don't know, 1997 and you've been around for 25 years, you can simply put established in 1987 or 1997. We're a family business established in 1997 by Jeff Jefferson, full stop. But writing something like, we're proud to have been established in 1997 as a family business in the local area dedicated to servicing our clients, kind of wastes the reader's time, doesn't really work.
It's like blah 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 blah.
Yeah, and they can't mark that. You don't get extra points, so that doesn't really work. So I'd say, trying to be too fancy with the writing. And the other kind of common mistake people make is the supporting documentation often takes a lot of time. So it might have asked for a modern slavery statement, it might have asked for your SWIMs, JSAs, environmental quality control procedures, risk management, collateral, and so forth. So you've got to do a decent job of those. I wouldn't say you need to be ISO accredited to win a tender. If it's not required, it's not required, but you've still got to do a good job of it, and that takes time. So you've got to get started on those early.
It's like you're going on an overseas trip and then you realise your passport's out of date.
6 months validity on the passport. Yep.
That's right. Three days before you go, you're like
Yeah.
running around like a madman trying to get your passport. I mean, that's often what happens with a tender is you leave
Yeah.
it to the last minute or you haven't kind of covered off all the logistics, which
Yeah.
if you don't get right can actually count you out despite all the hard work that you've done. So I think that
Yeah.
organisation is massive. Okay,
Biggest
so
fault.
one of the
Yep.
yeah, for sure. It takes. I mean, anything that's good takes effort. So it's about the effort that goes in, and that's hard when you're busy and got lots of stuff going on. So sometimes this is a staffing issue, or an organisation, or priorities or time management question as well. So we've talked about the fact that price is definitely part of the equation, but value
Yep.
and attributes and quality is obviously another part. And case studies or examples are a part of demonstrating quality. So let's talk about the process of putting your case studies or your examples in to back up your tender. Is it possible to write too much and bore the reader? How much in depth should you go? What should you do here?
You can go as in depth as you want, and you won't bore the reader as long as you're not fluffing about irrelevant information. Um, if your case study is too small, like, 3 lines or a paragraph, there is nowhere near enough information in it to score well. Let's take, for example, a maintenance contract for 15 buildings for the government, right? Say they're looking for maintenance, electrical services, combined electrical services and plumbing services. Okay, and you want to put in experience that you've got servicing 5 buildings for the government. The right way to structure it would be at least a paragraph on a synopsis of the nature of the project. So, we were appointed by the City of Canterbury to maintain 5 key buildings. This involved, and 3 or 4 bullet points on the scope of work. So that's how you'd introduce your kind of case study. Then you've got to talk about the key personnel involved because you're bidding for a tender with a certain team and they want to know that's your A team and that's the team that's got the experience on the previous jobs. So you'd say, okay, we had, Jeff was leading it, foreman, Tim, 3 apprentices, all of these team members will also be working on this contract if we're appointed. So you'd want to know that. Um, Then you've got your kind of challenges, and there's nothing to be ashamed about bringing challenges up as long as you present them as opportunities and solutions. So these were the challenges. We were working in a hospital environment. We need special accreditation to access. There were backup generators involved. We couldn't create dust in the work we were doing, whatever it might have been. And this is how we overcame those challenges. And then finally, as a case study, you'd want another paragraph or whatever it was about outcomes. So no safety issues, responded to all call outs within the KPI of 30 minutes or whatever it may be, and so forth. So they were your outcomes. And then finally, anything to do with innovation that you really want to talk about. So for example, there's the total whole cost of the project to discuss. You might have recommended that the client did an upgrade to different type of lighting to save them electricity or something about that. That's what you'd want to talk about as well. So your case study structure would be synopsis and scope, key personnel involved, any challenges, how you overcame them, and then the outcomes and what you delivered, as well as something on innovation value add if it's relevant. So overall, you're looking at about, three or four paragraphs, so a half a page of proper information
Yep.
for a decent case study. And that's the way that you score well in all aspects. And you've got to cover off everything in your case study. So you've got to cover off environmental, safety, um, quality assurance, and so forth. You can't just restrict the case study to we rewired the property and there were no issues. That wouldn't be adequate.
So something that really is in my mind with tenders and stuff is the whole concept of relationships.
Mhm.
And I think it can feel to people doing tenders, if you're the person doing the tender, that it's a black box that you sort of put the tender into, and a good answer comes out if you're kind of lucky. But I know for a lot of people, they're really good at creating relationships, and that gives them a little bit of an inside track, or they whatever.
Hmm.
How do you go about creating a relationship with the people you're doing the tender with? What's appropriate, and how do you know that you're talking to the right people as well?
It's a good question. It's difficult because it's different in different situations. But firstly, you're going to already have a relationship with them if you're an incumbent. So that's a completely different story. You're already providing it and you've already got a relationship. That's good and bad. It's good because you might already know the people that are going to be on the procurement panel. It's bad in the sense that you've had 3 years to make a mistake, somewhere along the way, as part of the tender response and as part of actually servicing the tender. Um, so if you're in that situation, then the relationship is whatever the relationship is. If you're new to it and you're saying, okay, I'm trying to business develop and develop relationships with the right people, um, there are different ways you can do it. I mean, the first thing I'd probably say is that once the tender's out, any relationship is you can't contact them either way if they're there because you've got a conflict of interest. Even if you've got a referee that's in the organization, that can be useful, but it will usually say in the tender requirements whether you're allowed to contact them or not to ask for permission to be a referee. So keep an eye out for that. Now, prior to that, depending on which local government area you're working in Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, there's a threshold where tenders kick in. So tenders might kick in at $100,000, for example, and anything less than $100,000 will only have to go out to 3 quotes, but it isn't a formal tender process. So obviously within any council or state government department, there will be people that are responsible for spending money, and you can contact them directly. So if I was a local tradie, there's no current tender out. I'd probably want to contact council and say I'm a local tradie. I've registered for tenders, but I'm looking for any other work that's below the threshold. And then you'd want to send through like kind of like a mini tender, like a capability statement we'd call it, but a kind of mini tender marketing brochure, introducing your services and trying to get in their face. Now, a lot of the time they'll say, okay, wait till we go out to tender. And we've already got an electrical or a plumbing supplier, wait till we go out to tender. But at least they've got some information, and then just be courteous and wait, contact back with them and so forth. Now there is, opportunities come up. For example, there may be issues with the supplier. Anything can happen. So it's good to be kind of in contact with them leading up to it. Um, so that's one avenue for relationships. Another avenue for relationships are sometimes councils have, or the New South Wales state government has information sessions, and that's way prior to the tender being released. And that happens particularly for some larger but also medium-sized tenders. So what they'll say is, okay, we're thinking of reintroducing the Council Works program, or where state government's looking at building the Sydney Metro, or it might be Northern Territory, whatever it may be. And what we're going to do is we're going to have an open day and explain to you the situation. There'll be an information center session. No tenders being released as yet. That's where you can go file your interest and try to develop one-on-one relationships with the personnel. If you're like a between say 5 and 20 people size of business, then you can't just take a day out to do that. So I wouldn't recommend going to one of those sessions for 4 hours as being like a really good investment of your time. Although it can be good for networking with some bigger providers and getting some subcontractor work, which is helpful.
Sure.
But definitely the direct phone call to council and registering does work.
Awesome. Okay. So how detailed does a methodology have to be, and what do you have to write in a methodology for, for example, a maintenance contract?
Used to be the case that the methodologies were fairly high level, but as tenders have become more competitive over the last 7 years, the methodology does need to be detailed, and you'll find as well that when you're looking at the kind of rating criteria, it might be 30% price, or 40% price, 30% experience, and like 20 or 25% methodology. So it's heavily marked and can be the kind of hinging point between winning and losing. So your methodology needs to be as detailed as possible, but I would say that when you develop, like for a maintenance project, for example, when you develop your program, or like a construction program for all the maintenance works if they've been tendered as a works package. So say we've got 6 months worth of maintenance works, including re-roofing and a whole lot of other things, plus continued maintenance for 3 years after that. Then the methodology needs to firstly explain the program in a written form. Secondly, reference the relevant Australian standards. And finally, combine not only what's in the program from a building perspective, because the program, you've got an Excel sheet and your planner or whoever it may be in the organization will dot point everything. But the methodology then needs to explain that in the context of the project. So if that maintenance works contract is at a hospital, you've got to talk about safety, access, meetings on site, meeting council supervisor, hold points that are put in place by the government entity to get the works approved before you can continue and so forth. That all needs to be integrated into the methodology as well as what's in your program. So that's the reason that you end up getting 5 and 10 page methods, or methodology methods we call them, for works that look relatively simple and aren't a big contract. It's just because you've got to explain the entire program out, and then you've got to integrate all the other aspects, environmental, health and safety and so forth, into that, as well as any of the council or government communication requirements that are inbuilt in the tender requirements.
So if you step back from that, because if you're not doing these tenders at the moment, some of that will probably feel quite overwhelming. But really what's going on here is there's a certain language or style that needs to be used to give yourself the best chance of winning. And it probably feels a little bit overwhelming, but once you know it, it's actually relatively simple. But if you don't know it, you're kind of putting yourself on the outside and making it very difficult for you to win the tender.
Yeah, pretty much. And also, every kind of tradie knows what they're doing. We find that they know the methodology without knowing it. So when we're talking to a tradie, they'll be like, oh, I don't know how to write it. And then after a half-hour conversation where they explain everything over, I'm going to do this, that, and the other, we go and write it. And they come back and say, oh, yeah, that's really good. I didn't know it. And we're like, well, you gave us all the information. So I think, generally speaking, tradies need to have the confidence. It doesn't matter if they're using a consultant like us, or they've got their secretary there, or they're working with their niece or their wife, whatever it may be, to just discuss it, say everything that they're going to do. And with all their experience, they'll find that they've got a lot of insight. And that's all pretty much what you need to do to develop a good methodology.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. So we've talked quite a bit about government work, government tenders, and even though you're based in Sydney and New South Wales and Aussie, the principles are the same wherever you do this stuff. There'll be all the regulations and stuff that you've got to follow, particularly if you're doing government work, because governments love to virtue signal and do all that sort of crap that makes them feel good and doesn't necessarily add a lot to the effectiveness of it, but needs to be done. I'm sorry if I went too far there. That's my little rant for the day. But let's talk about private sector tenders. Are government tenders and private sector tenders the same, and do we need to write them the same sort of way?
Private sector tenders are a little bit different. So with private sector tenders, firstly, there's a strong focus on graphics and presentation that government doesn't care about. So sometimes if you're a large, I wouldn't say a strata management company, but let's just say you're a mining company, for example, Rio
Yep.
Tinto or one of the big guys,
Yep.
and you've got tradies. We've helped clients, diesel technicians, everything, industrial plumbers, the lot,
Yep.
with the mining industry. But it might just be like a tradie bidding for a mining contract. So you've got a big tier one mining company. They're private sector. You need to make your tender response well presented, and graphics and all that need to be improved. There are a lot less limitations on how you're going to present your tender response. Like they don't say there's a maximum of 300 words. They don't say don't include attachments, anything like that. So you've got a lot of flexibility, which becomes a bit more work involved in presenting a quality tender response. But they do look at the branding and how it all kind of correlates with them. So that's the first thing. The second is pricing is important. But what's also important a lot of the time is time, delivery. Their writing style needs to be a lot more focused and blunt and aggressive. So you wouldn't walk to a government sector and say government tender and say, oh, this is the kind of ways that we're going to save you money on this bid, and this is how we can get it done faster. Even in a methodology that's designed to get it done faster, you would mention it, but you're not as blunt about it. So with a private sector tender, you're going to say to whatever mining company, these are the reasons why we're faster, we're better, we're more comprehensive, we're more responsive. It's a lot more objective and a lot kind of like a bit rougher, a bit more salesy. So you can get away with that in a private sector tender. Um, Need to be much better presented. Pricing, to go back to your question earlier, still has a large part to do with it. But you're dealing with fairly commercial guys who don't muck around, and therefore in the procurement teams, and therefore although pricing is important, so is experience, so is your team, and so is ability to deliver. But ability to deliver is absolutely critical. There's less flexibility in the private sector for delays and other issues. You've also got to keep an eye out in the tender response for conditions, because obviously when you're dealing with government, they kind of go a bit easier in terms of delays and any stuff ups you might do along the way. Um, but with the private sector, you'd want to get your lawyers to double check the tender response, make sure you've got all your insurances in place and so forth, because they haven't got any kind of model litigant guidelines. So it's a lot more blunt. Also, I'd say from a pricing perspective, you've really got to scope things out very well and ask all your questions and put all your assumptions into a private sector tender as opposed to a public sector tender. But they're worth winning.
The power is in the contract with a lot of this private sector stuff. And if you get the contract wrong, and that's part of the bid process, then you can take a haircut and end up really bald like me, uh, just based on the contract
Yeah.
and what the variations are or the exclusions are. And that's super important. One
Yeah.
thing I would love to talk about a bit more, Jason, is we talked about relationships in the government context,
Yeah.
because there's, what do they call it, due process.
Yeah.
Like you've got to,
Yeah.
everything's got to seem to be above board because it's taxpayer money and
Yeah.
yada yada yada.
Yeah.
So in the private sector, my experience is that relationships are more powerful. Have you got any thoughts around the relationships in the private sector and how it seems that sometimes you'll put a bid in or a tender, and then someone else just gets the opportunity to reprice, to have another go at it, and it's like, well, they must know them, or there's something. It almost feels like there's something backdoor or underhand going on.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of well, I'd say from our experience, I'd say it happens. It's not really illegal in the sense that, it's not the government. They can do it if they want to some
Yeah.
extent. But I think that, well, firstly, from a bid and no bid perspective, when you see that the tender's written and it kind of looks like one of your competitors has written it for themselves,
Yeah.
you'd want to, yeah, that happens all the time, right? So what happens is they're happy with you, or you've got your contact in there. Let's just say we've got a client, and I've had clients come to me and say, listen, we've got a current contract. They want a bit of help writing the tender so we can like re-win it here. So what do we do? So when you're interpreting the tender response, then you've got to make a decision in the private sector about whether it's worth bidding or not. And when you do that, the first question would be, is this tender written to favor someone that we know in the market when, it's a small market, so we could figure out who type thing. And if it is, then maybe it's not worth bidding. So that's what you've got to work on. The second thing you've got to figure out, which certainly happens. The second point I'd say is when they release the tender, there aren't the rules in the government about not contacting and so forth. Like they might have a protocol. So there's nothing wrong with going back and asking questions regarding the tender about what their motivations are and so forth. Because what happens is if you're a private sector company, you'll usually release a tender and explain the context of what's going on. Oh, we've got a current plumber, he's servicing 16 of our head office buildings, but we've just purchased another 3 buildings and they're in Northern Territory. But he doesn't have an office in the Northern Territory, so we're releasing a tender because we're looking for a local Northern Territory plumber. If you're an NT plumber, you'd go, okay, this is worth having a shot at. But sometimes they haven't explained that context, or you don't know the kind of situation. So there's nothing wrong with going back and saying, okay, why have we been invited to tender? What's the current situation with the incumbent provider? What are you looking for? What are the challenges and so forth? So that initial communication happens a lot more freely, and you can build a relationship or at least challenge them to figure out whether it's worth bidding or not.
Yeah,
Um,
my experience, and you
mhm,
probably got more to say on this, is that in the private sector, if you are bidding and maybe if you've got an estimator or a QS or someone in your business or a pricing person, hopefully that's a good thing to have. By the way, if you haven't done
yeah,
that yet, make a huge difference to your life
yeah,
and your business
yeah,
and your revenue. Is a savvy operator will spend a lot of time on the phone talking to the QS or the project manager of the company doing the tender,
mm,
and asking lots of questions. And often what I've seen happen is they can actually help often the specs are a bit crap, to be honest,
yeah,
or they haven't, they're a bit woolly. Let's
mhm,
put them that way. You could drive a bus through them sometimes. And so a lot of the clarifying questions that get asked, or maybe a few design suggestions or whatever, can actually really demonstrate a lot of value
yeah.
to the client, and can help put you in a strong position for the tender. That's certainly been my experience anyway.
Yeah, it's almost perfect. I'd say that's critical because especially I'd say as well if it's over like a Christmas break or something like that, little relationships develop in those interactions. You show insight that you know what you're talking about. You develop a relationship with them because you're asking all the questions, they're coming back to you and so forth. You do have to be careful if they're following a protocol where they disclose everything you ask and everything they've responded to everybody. In that case, you just got to be a little bit strategic about what sort
Yeah.
of insights you give out. But overall, I'd say it's definitely worth doing. The other point is that when you're in the private sector tender, there's nothing wrong with knocking back a bid, but maintaining the relationship. And that happens often because the reality is, okay, we don't have the capacity to bid for this at the moment, but we want to bid for the next one, and you reject it. You actually get some credibility sometimes when you reject it for a logical reason, but you've got to make sure you nail and convert that relationship so you get invited to tender again. And the other point is if you are successful, then a lot of clients I've seen, what's happening is they'll win the tender, but they won't grow the client. And a lot of the time, it might be a small part of work, or you might have lost out on work, whatever it may be. But just that interaction gives you the footing to get the conversation going, especially with tier one and tier two builders.
Yeah,
So
for
ask
sure.
as many questions as possible, just to show how
Yeah,
that you know what you're talking about.
and the thing is that there are criteria people get assessed on, but relationships do count because people do.
Yeah,
They just have little conversations with people they like, and they let stuff slip, and they'll talk about stuff, and
yeah,
and if you're smart, you pick up on stuff.
yeah,
See it all the
most
time.
definitely. And also with private sector, the criteria that they issue might not be the criteria that they end up using. So they've said, okay, 40% price, 40% capacity and experience, and 20% innovation, but it might be that innovation 60%. They've really frustrated with their current maintenance provider because they're not showing enough reporting and not taking any pictures. So you go into the bid and you say, okay, we provide pretty much the same service, pricing's the same. The only difference is that everything we do, we're going to take a photo of, our technicians will take a photo of, they're going to send it as a report on their iPad. It will come straight through to your email. Here's a demo. And they say, oh yeah, that's what we want for insurance purposes. So it's nothing to do with pricing, nothing to do with experience, not even expertise. They're just worried about their insurance and so forth. And the private sector, they'll change it last minute. They'll just
They
do a,
do.
yeah,
100% to whatever suits.
yeah,
One question that I've found that a lot of our members ask is they can ask the decision makers or the QS or whoever they work for, hey, what is it that frustrates you about other service providers? That's a really good question, because then they'll tell you everything that they hate about the people they're using at
Yeah.
the moment, and then you can actually work that into your bid or your tender to obviously put it in a positive light.
Yeah,
So
most
yeah,
definitely.
lots of fun you can have there if you're really proactive. I guess the message is, that you're sort of getting across is that for the private stuff, you don't. Sometimes for the government stuff, it's like you put it in and it is a little bit of a black box. There's stuff you can do, but for the private
Mm.
sector, you can work the levers way more
Yeah.
because it is more flexible and there's less. It's not that it's not above board; it's just different.
No, it's just different. And also, if you don't comply with the private sector requirements, you can explain it and bid anyway.
Yeah,
So you don't have to worry. You don't have to. They don't just throw. They just throw it in the bin. I mean, if you've got some contacts in there, they'll even just pass it and say, "Okay, mate." They ring you up and they say, "Oh, you forgot this. Please send it through," and so forth. So it's a lot. It's a
that's
lot more
exactly the point.
flexible.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. You've
yeah,
got you've
yeah,
got
yeah.
flexibility. It's worth having a shot at. The only other thing I'd say to be careful of is if you hire like a supervisor from one of your competitors and he comes in bragging about how he's got all the relationships, just double check the relationships and that private company doesn't, isn't frustrated with them. Because we've seen that happen a lot of the times, someone will say to me, look, I've just hired this guy, he used to work for whatever it is, Dynamite Electrical or something, or X-Ray Plumbing or whatever it may be, and he knows them really well, he's got a fantastic relationship, they love him there, so really excited. And ends up being that he's the reason that they lost the tender. Um, so you've got to suss out the market and figure out what's going on off the record from the potential buyers and so forth to make sure you don't put your foot in it. And it does happen often, unfortunately.
He definitely had the relationship, the one you didn't want.
Yeah, the one you didn't want. Yeah, so
That's right.
got to be careful.
So, love to know, do fancy graphics help win tenders?
In the private sector and sometimes in the public sector, they do, or at least they're a requirement that a lot of people have. So you've kind of got to do it anyway just to be half decent. But they will lose your tender when they explicitly ask you not to include fancy graphics. So sometimes they say do not include generic marketing content, do not use graphics and so forth. So don't. That happens a lot in private and public. But where you've got a tender response where they're kind of looking for something special, I'd say having some graphics which you can build up over the years and drop into your tender can help you win. It's a sad fact because really it should be based on experience, capacity, capability. Um, but there's always something about having a good looking tender response that increases your win rate. So it does play a part, yes.
Yeah, and it's pretty simple. I mean, people do judge a book by its cover.
Yep.
And if you want to look professional, if you want to be professional, sometimes it just pays to kind of look professional.
Yeah, I think so. And the cheapest way to do it is to pretty much use similar graphics every time you tender. So I'd say if you're a tradie and you've got, I don't know, whoever's doing your graphics, then make sure you do it based on something generic. So don't do it on something tailored for that tender opportunity. If you're at least a small to medium business size level, because you can't cut and paste and use that again and again. But your front covers, your team profile, a team chart, scope of capabilities, that sort of thing you put into graphics and you can drop them into every tender that comes along.
Yeah, for sure. Just to, I guess, sort of wrap things up, I want to make sure people listening, really understand this process.
Mm-hmm.
When someone gets a tender, and you've talked about, price is 40% and experience and attributes maybe 40% and methodology or innovation or it could be something else, sustainability, which is a big buzzword these days.
Local content, yeah.
Local content, I mean, they will vary. So effectively what happens is the person doing the tender will rate the person on each of those areas and then basically add it up and the score at the bottom is who wins. That's kind of how it works?
Exactly. With government, yes, and with
Yep.
private sector, most of the time, yes.
Yep.
And if you stuff up, if there's a question on environment or local content's critical, right? Like it's always a big part of it. But if you might score really well in pricing, really well in capacity, but you stuff up environmental or you stuff up a 10%er, and that's pretty much the be all and end all to the tender response, you end up losing, you get 89.6 and the other person gets 92 and they've won. And they might have been more expensively priced. So that's definitely how it works. They use a kind of like a weighted criteria. They add it all together. And then if their favorite tenderer doesn't score well, they might change things a bit. But overall, that's the way it works, yes.
Awesome. Okay. So I have one sort of last question, Jason, because this has been fun. Let's say you're a small, maybe a medium-sized company. Maybe you've got 10 to 25, 30 guys, girls running around, and you really want to get into some slightly bigger projects. How can those sort of small to medium-sized companies compete with some of the larger firms to win tenders?
I'd say three key points where they can definitely, we've done it before, so first thing I'd say is it's definitely possible. Don't think that you won't win them. You can definitely give it a crack and win. First point is make sure you beat them on local content. The reality is you've got 30 guys working for you, another national company's got 120. Those 120 people are spread around 5 states. You might be only based in Queensland. So you're really going to win because you've got 30 local staff in Queensland. You're as big as them in Queensland, and you've got to position it like that. You've got to say 100% of our staff are locally based. We've got 6 locally based apprentices. 96% of our suppliers are based in Queensland, in the Brisbane area or Moreton Bay, whatever it may be. And we support, 7 local charities. And so localizing it and playing to your strengths, and in this case, your strength is that you're a medium-sized business as opposed to a national-sized business, puts you in a very solid position. So you're going to get points on that. The second point is you've got to fudge your innovation and reporting and IT a little bit. So, if you look at the horticulture industry, all right, so tradies, whatever it may be, you've got clients that you've got operators that are national or even multinational, at least Australia and New Zealand, right, spread, even Australia and Pacific. And they'll have the latest reporting techniques, and everyone's got an iPad, and there's an online portal where the government can log in and see progress of works and what's been undertaken and so forth. Okay, you're a medium-sized company, or you got 30 blokes working for you, you don't have that yet, but what do? You ring up the vendor, you say, look, I'm interested, I want to get a demo. You take all your screenshots, you get it all sorted out, and you present it that you've already got it. And if you win the tender, you're going to implement that straight away before the tender even begins. So you're going to have that reporting, that IT capability. So you've got to present like you've got the technology and the systems and processes of a 120-person company, even if you don't, but at least implement them on time so you haven't lied in your tender. And then you've got a good enough chance of winning the response. Or winning the contract. And the third part of the strategy, I'd say, is to put the time into tailoring and personalizing your bid, because larger companies will have a full-time tender writing or 2 or 3 people, and they'll get lazy. They'll cut and paste. They'll forget about it. They won't get time to check the tenders before they submit them. So do a good job and have a good crack. Make sure you localize it, and you've got to kind of fake it till you make it on all the other aspects that they ask for and that they've got. And if you hire someone that's worked at one of those larger companies, then just get insight into what they put in their bids so that you know what needs to be included. And then you can definitely win.
Yeah, and I think there's something here also that's important, is the confidence to do it. I don't know what it is. We think bigger is better. But often if you've got a solid business, actually the service delivery that you provide is top notch. Yeah. Just because they're a bigger client doesn't mean they do a better job. And sometimes it's not a better job because their leadership and management's got a bit loose. And so you can actually do an exceptional job. So don't forget that you actually might just be the best person for the job as well.
Yeah. No, most definitely. And it's usually, I'd say 80% of the time, that's precisely the case. I'd say a lot of our clients, like kind of small to medium, underestimate themselves. They think it's too hard, but they smash it. And also, don't forget that you've got leadership that's hands-on. So you're going to have much better quality output when you've got hands-on leadership than when you've got a structure where you've got management and so forth. So back yourself and you'll win. And there are lots of stories of, like, there's a 70% win rate of people in that position, so there's no real issue.
Mate, this has been awesome. Cool. You're doing great work. If anyone wants any help or wants to chat to you more, what's the best way of reaching out, Jason?
By email or mobile. So yep. We're always on the phone.
Yeah, we'll put those details in the show notes, so we'll get that in there if anyone wants to chat more about getting some help with in terms of writing tenders. That'd be awesome. But this has been great, man. Really appreciate your time. Had a good cool. Fun, and definitely, it's not a black box. You can work it and get way better results than you thought if you really understand how to do the process.
Yep. Cheers. Thanks for having me on.
No worries, man. Take care.
All right. Cheers. Have a good one.
Congratulations on being part of a select group of savvy business owners who are taking their businesses to the next level. And to help you on your journey, don't forget to check out our show notes for a copy of our free book, The Profitable Tradie, and other valuable resources. Thanks for being a part of this special group, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Profitable Tradie podcast.